They said they didn't have the money. That was the first lie Eli ever remembered clearly. He was 14 and the wind that winter in rural New York came with knives in it. Every morning he would brace himself against it with two sweaters, one borrowed from the school's lost and found, but it was never enough. His breath came out in clouds, his fingers cracked and bled, and still he waited because his father had promised that if things got better, he'd get that new coat. Things did get better, apparently. A week later, Eli came home from school and saw them. 3 coats hung proudly by the front door, sleek insulated matching, one for his stepmother, 2 for her daughters, none for him. His stepmother caught his eye and smiled, the kind that knew too much and cared too little. "Try not to freeze out there, sweetheart," she said, the way someone might say, "bless your heart," when they meant the opposite. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence had long become his armor. That night, Eli sat by the window in his room, staring out at the frost crawling across the glass. He watched the breath rise from his lips like ghosts. Outside, the girls were playing in their new jackets, throwing snowballs and laughing like winter was just another game. Inside, Eli wrapped himself tighter in blankets that still couldn't block the ache. It wasn't just the cold, it was the knowing. Knowing that he could be in the same room, the same family, the same world, and still be invisible. There were no fights, no shouting matches. That would have required the energy of care. What Eli received was worse: indifference painted as discipline, absence wrapped as structure. He was always the one told to be mature, to understand the situation, to not make things harder than they already are. But it was never hard for them to exclude him. It came naturally. He had been born to his father's first wife, a woman who died young and whom no one in the house mentioned unless it was to guilt trip him into being grateful. "Your stepmom didn't have to take you in," they would say. "She's doing her best," but Eli saw through it. He wasn't a son. He was a remnant, a reminder, a body still around after the family had moved on. That winter became a memory that never fully thawed. A yearbook photo where he looked smaller than he was. A field trip missed because the permission slip required payment they couldn't afford. A Christmas morning where everyone got boots and gloves except him. And through it all, Eli learned how to disappear quietly, how to swallow shame like snowflakes. Cold at first, then wet, then gone. But what no one knew, not even Eli at the time, was that something else had settled into him alongside the silence. A resolve, a fragile flickering spark. Not of revenge, not even of justice. Just a longing to one day be the kind of person who made someone feel seen, because he knew exactly what it was like to be erased. If this story echoes something buried in you, a cold memory, a closed door, a love withheld, you're not alone on Hard Stories. We tell the stories that were never supposed to be told, the lives that mattered even when no one said they did. Stay with us for what comes next, because Eli's story is just beginning. By the time Eli turned 18, he had mastered the art of staying unnoticed. He moved like someone who expected to be stepped over, spoke like someone who knew his words weren't meant to echo. But beneath that quiet surface was movement, slow, deliberate, patient, like someone stitching their own wings from scraps. He had taken a job at a fast food chain in town where the hours were long, the oil never stopped burning, and the pay came in coins that smelled like salt and sweat. He didn't complain. Every dollar went into a jar hidden under the bed. That jar wasn't just money. It was his escape plan. Nobody noticed when he began packing. His room had always been bare. No one asked where he was going. When the acceptance letter from SUNY Albany came in the mail, his father just said, "Well, at least you'll have heat over there." His stepmother didn't even look up. The last thing he packed was a coat. Not new, not warm, but meaningful. It had been given to him by Mrs. Landry, his English teacher. She had found him one morning standing outside before school started, shivering, pretending to scroll on a cracked phone. Without asking, she returned the next day with the coat and said simply, "You'll grow into it. Until then, let it grow into you." When the bus pulled away from the town, no one waved, no one stood on the porch, no one called after him. But Eli didn't look back. Some places aren't meant to be missed, only survived. Albany was nothing like home, and that was a gift. He arrived with 2 duffel bags and a heart full of caution. The campus buzzed with people who laughed loudly, kissed, freely questioned everything. For the first time, Eli saw men holding hands like it wasn't a protest, women wearing suits like it wasn't a costume. It felt like a world where nobody had to ask for permission to exist. But coming out wasn't brave. It was inevitable. When you've been erased long enough, telling the truth becomes a way to breathe. Eli didn't make a speech. He didn't write a post. He just stopped hiding and let the world fill in the blanks. Some people noticed, most didn't care. And in that beautiful indifference, he found freedom. Still, college was not some magical balm. There were days Eli ate from vending machines, days he borrowed library computers just to fill out meal plan appeals. Loneliness clung like an old scarf, but there was also resilience. He found it in quiet conversations with other queer students, in free counseling sessions, in late-night walks under streetlights that didn't feel like interrogation lamps. And then there was Jonah. They met at a volunteer orientation for a campus crisis hotline. Jonah was a year older, studying community mental health with a calmness that made the room feel less sharp. He didn't flirt, he didn't push, he just listened and stayed. Over time, what started as small moments grew into routine. Jonah waiting with a cup of coffee after class, Eli remembering Jonah's favorite thrift store. A silent agreement to hold space for each other, no matter how messy or guarded it got. They moved in together after graduation, not because it was romantic, but because it was right. Because home didn't have to be a place you came from. Sometimes it was a place you built brick by brick, name by name, hand in hand. Their apartment was modest: a secondhand couch, a leaky faucet, a cat named Marbles who hated everyone but Eli. But it was warm, always warm. Eli had become a youth caseworker helping LGBTQ+ teens find safe housing and emergency support. His job didn't pay much, but it paid enough. More importantly, it gave his story a purpose he never knew he needed. Every time a teenager cried on his shoulder or thanked him for calling them they or he without flinching, Eli felt like he was wrapping his own younger self in another layer. He no longer needed validation from the family that had overlooked him. He no longer feared being alone in a room full of people. But the memory of that winter, the coat that never came, still lived inside him. Quiet but present, like a scar that no longer hurts but never forgets. Because you can leave a house. You can even leave a name, but what you carry with you that takes longer to unpack. And one cold morning in November, it all came rushing back. Not through memory, but through a voice he hadn't heard in years. It came as a voicemail, the kind that didn't belong in Eli's world anymore. He recognized the voice before the message even began. Roughened by age, a little slower, but still carved with the same tone that once made apologies sound like obligations, Eli the man said. Just the name, no. Son. No, hey, no, how are you? Just Eli. I know it's been a while. Your stepmom, she lost her job and I've been dealing with this knee surgery. They moved us into a temporary housing unit. But I don't know, it's been cold. Just a few weeks. Just until we get back on our feet, I thought maybe you'd understand. Understand? The word hit Eli like a draft under a door he thought he'd sealed years ago. He stood frozen in the kitchen, one hand still on the grocery bag he'd been unpacking. Jonah had just returned from work, setting down his keys, when he noticed the stillness. What is it? Jonah asked. Eli didn't speak. He just replayed the message once, then again. Jonah listened quietly, his gaze never leaving Eli's face. When the recording ended, he stepped forward, not to offer advice, but to hold space. Do you want them here? He asked softly. Eli shook his head, not in anger, but in something deeper. That quiet, aching clarity that comes when a wound reopens, not because it's weak, but because it never got to heal properly. I don't want revenge, he said almost to himself. I just don't want to reopen a house I've already rebuilt elsewhere. That night, he didn't sleep. The memory of cold floors, of muffled laughter behind closed doors, of birthdays skipped and dinners eaten, standing, they all returned layered like sediment. And beneath it all, the coat, the one he never got, the one that told him everything he needed to know about who was worth protecting in that house and who wasn't. 2 days passed. No second call, no text, just silence. Eli told himself that was fine, that he had no obligation to respond, that he had built a life with warmth and truth and chosen family, and he had. But grief has its own compass. It doesn't follow reason. Then the letter came. It wasn't long. Just one page, no ask, no plea, no address for reply. Just a note written in handwriting. Eli hadn't seen since he was a boy, filling out permission slips. I know I wasn't a good father. I know you asked for so little, and even that, I failed to give that coat. I think about it more than I should. It sounds small. Maybe it was, but it wasn't. Was it? I'm sorry I made you feel like you didn't belong in your own home. I hope you found a better one. I really do. There was no signature. Just the word Dad. At the bottom, like a title without the weight it once carried. Eli held the letter for a long time. His hands didn't shake, but his chest did. He sat at the edge of the bed, Jonah beside him, neither of them speaking. It wasn't the apology that made him cry. It was the fact that it had come at all, that it was real. Honest. Late tears came slowly, quietly, the kind you don't sob, just release. They didn't cleanse. They didn't heal, but they made room. Still, he didn't call. He didn't write back. He didn't offer shelter to the man who had once told him, "You're lucky to even have a roof," because sometimes love isn't proven by return. Sometimes it's proven by choosing not to bleed where you've already been cut. But something in Eli shifted. A stirring. A question. Not about his father, but about himself. How many other kids were out there shivering unseen, told their pain was too small to matter? How many grew up like him, scraping together warmth from borrowed things and broken silences? And more importantly, what if he could change that? What if the coat that never came became the first gift he gave? The idea came quietly. Like most meaningful things do not, as a grand vision, but as a nudge. Eli had passed the shelter on East Monroe 100 times before, often on his way to work. But that morning, as the first real snow of the season began to fall, he saw something that pulled him to a stop. A teenage boy standing by the fence, hugging his arms to his chest, dressed in nothing more than a hoodie and worn sneakers. His breath fogged the air. His lips were blue. Eli didn't approach him. He didn't snap a photo. He didn't post about it online. He just stood there, heart aching. A familiar cold crawling back into his bones, because that boy wasn't just a stranger. He was a mirror. Later that evening, Eli sat at the kitchen table scrolling through pages of nonprofits and local aid programs. He found plenty of coat drives, seasonal ones, corporate-sponsored, faith-affiliated, but none specifically for kids like him, kids who had been turned away, not because their parents were poor, but because their parents had rejected who they were. He remembered being 14, walking home in sub-zero wind, his ears burning, pretending the sting was strength. He remembered watching his stepsisters gaggle in their new jackets while he rehearsed ways to not take up space. The pain of being excluded wasn't in what he lacked. It was in knowing they chose not to see him. That's when it clicked. He didn't want to simply give away coats. He wanted to give dignity, a sense of being seen, a message that said, "You matter. Your warmth matters. Your body is worth protecting." So he launched Winter with Pride, a grassroots campaign to collect new or gently used winter gear specifically for LGBTQ+ youth experiencing homelessness, family rejection, or economic hardship. No dress codes, no questions about orientation, just warmth with pride. At first it was small. A few friends helped him set up a simple website. Jonah reached out to his therapy network. Eli contacted shelters, LGBTQ+ centers, school counselors. He shared his story, not in anger, but in truth. "When I was 14, he wrote in the opening blog post, I asked for a coat and got a lesson in invisibility. Now I want to turn that memory into something no kid should have to repeat." The response was slow at first. Then, like the first flakes before a storm, it gathered momentum. A local news station asked to interview him after reading the post. Eli sat in front of the camera, nervous but composed, wearing the very coat Ms. Landry had once given him. He didn't mention names. He didn't assign blame. He just told the truth. "We often talk about how kids need food and shelter," he said. "But what about the in-between moments? The bus stop, the walk to school, the line outside a shelter? What do we tell a kid who's freezing and alone, not because they were forgotten by society, but because their own family told them to leave?" The story aired on a Thursday night. By Friday, his inbox overflowed. Donations poured in. A retired seamstress in Connecticut offered to sew custom hats. A queer-run fashion startup from Brooklyn shipped 200 insulated jackets, and an anonymous donor sent a check for $20,000 with a note that simply said, "No child should suffer the winter for being who they are." Eli cried when he opened that envelope, not because of the money, but because someone somewhere had read his story and answered not with pity, but with power. He began organizing drop-offs across the state. He coordinated with shelters to identify LGBTQ+ teens most in need. He created personalized care packages, each with a coat, gloves, a handwritten letter, and a small laminated card that read, "You are not a mistake. You are not alone. This world is better with you in it." But when it came time to decide where the first shipment should go, Eli paused. The database highlighted a familiar zip code, Johntown, the very place where his father now lived. In that low-income housing complex where heat was often unreliable, and the past still lingered like a draft under every door. Jonah saw him hesitate. "You don't have to," he said gently. But Eli shook his head. "No, I want to." So he sent the boxes. He didn't include a note. He didn't announce it, but he made sure the volunteers knew. "These coats are for everyone," he said, "even the ones who taught me what it means to be cold." And somewhere tucked inside one of those boxes, he added a single extra item, an old photograph of himself at 14 wearing a second-hand coat too big for his frame, but with a smile that hinted at survival. Because sometimes healing isn't loud. Sometimes it's a quiet delivery, a choice to give what you never received, not as repayment, but as release. It arrived on Christmas Eve, the envelope off-white and slightly creased, tucked beneath a stack of cards from friends and old co-workers. Eli noticed it only because the handwriting stopped him. Not quite neat, not quite rushed, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. He opened it carefully. Inside was a card. Nothing festive, just plain cardstock, with a quiet message written in blue ink. "I saw the boxes. You turned what we never gave you into something beautiful. You always deserved more. I'm sorry, Dad. No return address, no phone number." Just those words. Eli stared at it for a long time, not out of shock. The shock had passed years ago, but because of how simple it was. Not dramatic, not begging. Just a man finally admitting that he had seen what his son had become, and perhaps for the first time truly understood. He didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, he placed the card gently on the kitchen shelf next to a framed photo of him and Jonah at the first coat drive pickup. In the background, a little girl in rainbow gloves grinned wide enough to crack winter itself. The house was warm. Cinnamon from the oven drifted into every room. Jonah was setting the table, humming quietly. Friends were due to arrive soon. Queer kids from the youth shelter, a couple Eli had helped find housing, even Missy Landry, now retired but glowing in a handmade sweater. Marbles the cat sat curled beneath the heater, content and territorial. And outside snow began to fall soft and soundless. Not the kind that burned like it used to. This snow felt different. Less like a memory, more like a pause between the notes of a song that was still being written. Eli walked over to the window holding a mug of hot cider. He didn't think about the house he left or the people who didn't choose him. He thought about the coats, hundreds of them now wrapped around bodies that once felt disposable. Thought about the notes he included in every package. Thought about the boy at the shelter's gate and whether he'd smiled when he opened the box. He thought about the kind of man he'd become, because warmth, he had learned, wasn't a coat or a house or even a father's apology. It was the act of choosing over and over again to open your door when no one opened theirs for you. That night, they all sat around the table, candles lit. Laughter loud, the kind of holiday Eli once thought belonged only to other people. Plates were passed, stories were told. No one said the word family, but everyone felt it. When it came time for the toast, Jonah looked across the table and raised his glass. "To what we carry," he said, "and what we choose to let go." Eli smiled. "And to what we choose to give," he added. Outside, the wind picked up. The kind of wind that might have once reminded him of all he had lost, but now it reminded him of how far he'd come. What does warmth mean to you? Is it a place, a person, a second chance? Drop your story in the comments. Someone might need to read it tonight. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more real stories of resilience, healing, and the quiet power of becoming exactly who you were meant to be. Because even the coldest winters can lead to something beautifully warm.